Hello summoners and welcome to another ProGuides video. I'm Crumbs and I'm here with our 12.10 low elo tier list. Our regular tier list, which we post with the patch rundown and mid-patch updates, is aimed at around the high gold to platinum skill level, but we kept moving champs like Jace and the Kali up on the tier list since, when played perfectly, those champs are pretty broken. But the thing is, people in the gold to plat level don't play perfectly. That's why we recently made a high elo tier list to differentiate what's objectively the best when played to perfection versus a realistic performance in the middle elos. And that got us thinking, why not also make a tier list for the lower levels of play too? I know it's tempting to try and lock in what the pros and high elo streamers play, but trust me, the best thing to do for climbing is acknowledging that sometimes some champs are a bit too hard to pull off until you get better at some of the fundamentals of the game. And conversely, some champs are way better at lower levels because your enemies aren't as coordinated or don't have the game knowledge and mechanics needed to counter them. So, with all of that said, let's get into this tier list, shall we? First up, it's our top laners. It looks like we underestimated how good the new Olaf would be as a top pick. We knew he'd be good, but we didn't think he'd be the best. At all levels of skill, he's completely dominating the lane. And since this patch is gonna favor longer, extended fights over super front-loaded ones, he's only gonna get better. If we were to ever implement a god tier for this list, Olaf Top would deserve it all to himself. Sion is getting promoted up to the OP tier. Statistically, that may not make a lot of sense. He ranges anywhere from meh to just above average when you look at his win rate. But Sion is one of those champs where you really have to take stats with a big grain of salt. Just think about how many players tank his stats by either trying to do the suicide Sion strategy or just by building wrong. Hint, Prowler's Claw has a horribly negative win rate. Glass Cannon Sion may be funny when it works, but it's overall just very bad. When you actually play and build Sion the right way, he's a really powerful champ. He may be a tank, but he does a lot of damage and is a laner that can win or at least go even in almost all lanes. In teamfights, he has too much damage and CC to ignore, but he's so tanky it takes forever to bring him down. Dr. Mundo gets dropped down to the S tier. He's still gonna be a super strong pick, especially since tanks are gonna be even harder to bring down on this patch. That said, he just doesn't quite compare to the carrying power of the other champs in the OP tier at the moment, so he had to be brought down a notch. Malphite gets bumped up to the S tier. With overall durability going up, he should slap around AD champs even more now. Plus, teamfighting is gonna matter way more since games will be less snowbally, and his ult makes him one of the very best champs for grouping up and forcing 5v5s. We must remember that this is the low elo tier list, and in lower elos, relying on your team to 5v5 isn't always the best, so maybe that second part doesn't weigh quite as heavily as it would higher on the ladder. We can consider this a tentative move for now. Akshan gets dropped down to the B tier. He's just one of those champs that does a lot better in higher levels of play. Anyone can pick him up and bully an opponent in a 1v1, but the issue is top lane isn't always a 1v1. You have to take the enemy jungler into account, which means managing the wave and trading in ways that don't just make you a free gank target. And even when you do play it well, you still need a jungler that can play to your lane, and without that, all that pressure and priority you have doesn't mean much. There are other bullies that are a lot more independent than Akshan. Now, for the jungle, here's our list. Wukong gets promoted to the OP tier. We originally predicted Wukong would be insanely broken after his little revamp, so we were surprised when the stats didn't show that right away. But it turns out it was just an issue with people actually catching on. Now, he's one of the very best junglers in the game across all levels of skill. And he's only gonna be stronger on this next patch. Wukong loves extended fights, it's what his kit is all about. And since that's what this new patch is going to favor, there's a strong argument that he's not just the best jungler, but one of the best champs in the game, period. Diana gets bumped down to the S tier. Honestly, we're not too sure how this patch is going to affect her. On the one hand, Diana is technically an assassin. She does a lot of burst damage, and since that's being nerfed, she may be hit hard. But on the other hand, Diana also does very well in extended fights, since her passive and low cooldowns give consistently high DPS. Also, since you're less likely to get blown up, it'll be easier to get her full combo off before you yourself get nuked down. So, with all that said, here are some predictions. Glass Cannon Diana is probably gonna be a bit weaker. It'll still carry hard when you snowball early, but will be more feast or famine. I think some type of tankier build could potentially pop up for her. Look out for Riftmaker Diana. In combination with Conqueror, her shields, and Omnivamp plus true damage, she can thrive in extended trades. Look at Shyvana. She was an awful C-tier champ, but once people started building her like a bruiser, she became an absolute monster. Who knows, a build like that could put Diana right back in the OP tier. The exemplar of Demacia, Jarvan, gets demoted to the B tier, and this may be too generous. He's just been underperforming lately. The only reason we're not ready to put him in the C tier yet is because his team fighting is still strong. As we've talked about before, team fighting is going to be more important on this patch, so we'll check in next patch and see how things pan out for him. If he doesn't improve by then, he'll definitely be going down another level. Everyone's favorite horse gets moved right back down to the C tier. Hecarim's buff helped a teeny tiny bit, but when the champ is doing as poorly as him, that doesn't mean much. The only way Hecarim does well is by snowballing super hard early game, and since snowballing is gonna be less impactful on 12.10, he's just gonna be a worse pick. Now, here's our mid lane tier list. Swain gets promoted up to the OP tier. His mid-scope update has turned him into an absolutely disgusting champ, and with 12.10, he's only gonna get even better. With his perpetual healing and teamfighting, as long as you can keep his ult up, the only real counter to Swain is to burst him down in one go. But that's gonna be a lot harder with the extra durability we're getting on this patch. So if playing an unkillable Demon King sounds fun to you, this is probably the best mid laner to abuse on this patch. Yasuo is getting demoted to the S tier. He's another champ that you want to avoid taking the stats at face value, however. There's a lot of nuances to Yasuo's numbers. I know it's super subjective, but you have to think about how many Yasuo players tilt super easily and just run it down in games. On the other hand, Yasuo is one of the most played champs for Smurfs. With those two big wildcards heavily affecting his stats, we can't just lean on what the stats are actually saying. So, here's the verdict. If you can play him without tilting, he's objectively a pretty strong champ. He has decent laning and scales harder than almost any other pick in the role. That said, he's also really susceptible to being camped, so he's not quite as consistent as the champs in the OP tier. Talia gets bumped down to the B tier. She's a pretty dominant pick in the upper elos, but down here, she's just not doing too great. A lot of that is probably because she's a pretty roam heavy champ, and that style just doesn't do too well in the lower levels of play. Pyke is finally getting demoted down to the C tier. Riot actually managed to nerf mid-Pyke effectively, it seems. There's just no real upside to picking this. You have to be so insanely fed for it to be strong, and even then, other picks would use the same lead so much better. Syndra gets moved down to the D tier. With burst champs being weaker, there's a very low chance Syndra becomes viable until they give her some pretty meaningful buffs. LeBlanc has mistakenly been in our A tier for a while now. She's been more of a C tier pick. Even in the higher elos, where she generally does pretty well, she's been flopping. Like Syndra, she's really gonna feel the durability changes badly and will be dropping down to the D tier. She is in major need of buffs right now. Despite her awful performance, LeBlanc remains a relatively popular champ. Across all elos, she's the 14th most picked mid laner in the game. That may not sound high, but remember that the mid lane champ pool is huge. There are a lot of better mid laners that get picked less than her, which I don't really get. Why do people want to lock in something with such an awful win rate so often? The answer is probably because of her flashy playstyle and popularity in pro play and high elo. It's the same reason you see so many try to pull off a Sylas, a Zed, or an Aurelia. And that brings us to today's question of the day. What champ are you tired of seeing your teammates int on? For me, it's Ahri. I know her ult has 3 dashes that allow you to reposition and engage in a fight, but from my point of view, all I see is 3 chances to get right next to the enemy and int. But that's just me, and we want to hear from you, so let us know your answer down in the comments. Now, let's move things down to the bot lane. Vayne's moving up to the OP tier with the durability changes lowering the effective damage of everyone in the game. Her percentage-based true damage puts her at the head of the pack amongst marksmen. Her DPS will be largely unaffected later in the game. Also, laning is going to be a lot less punishing in general, so you'll more consistently be reaching that point in the game with her where you're able to 1v5 teamfights. Swain's being moved up to the OP tier as well. Just as with mid lane, he's probably the best pick in this role. He's just too hard to bring down, easily healing through your opponent's damage while dishing out tons yourself. And things only get worse for your opponents in teamfights, where you get to use all 5 of your enemies as a bunch of health batteries. Jin's dropping down to the S tier for now, though this is one of our tentative changes. On the one hand, snowballing is less effective, so his early lane bullying isn't quite as important, but on the other, Jin is technically a utility pick, and since that's something we're putting more value on for 12.10, he may end up right back in the OP tier next time around. Misfortune is getting promoted to the A tier. She probably should have been here before for low elo since she tends to do better down here than in the upper ranks, but she definitely deserves a spot with the next patch. She may even get bumped up to the S tier depending on how things go. The main reason for that is that all-in champs are falling out of favor, but poke ones will be a lot stronger. With Comet and Emax, that's exactly what she's all about. Draven is being put down to the C tier. He relies heavily on his support to get him cash-ins, and in the lower ranks, you really don't want to bank on your lane partner being responsible for making your champ viable. To finish things off, we have our supports. It's probably no surprise, but Swain's support is also getting a promotion to the OP tier. Everything we mentioned for mid and bot carries over just as well here. You'll hard carry 2v2 fights in lane, and in team fights, you'll still have a huge impact. Since you're on a bit of a lower income, build for utility over raw carrying power. That means you'll want Everfrost or Imperial Mandate over Liandry's, and then Zhonya's and Rylai's to be as useful as you can in 5v5s. Xerath is getting promoted to the S tier. Since poke mages are generally going to be a lot stronger on this patch, it makes sense that the poster child of it is gonna be OP. You'll be able to pretty much solo carry the entirety of the laning phase, allowing your AD carry to free farm while you harass your foes from a distance. And everything I said about Xerath also applies to Vel'Koz, but he's sort of a worse version of Xerath as a support, so his promotion lands him in the A tier instead. And that about wraps things up for our 12.10 low elo tier list. I hope you enjoyed the video. Since making this list involved going over all the champs in all the roles, I'm sure we overlooked a pick here or there. So feel free to let us know if you think we missed something down in the comments below. One last thing, don't forget to check out our Discord in the description box below, where you can discuss League further or just hang out and be a part of our community. I can't wait to see you guys back for the next video, but until then, good luck on the Rift and may the LP gods smile down upon you.